In preparation for the ICD-10 transition, which has a start date of October 1st, 2015, it is highly recommended that you create or update your diagnosis checklist for your templates. Diagnosis checklists are updated via the template editor. This video will walk you through a general overview of adding and configuring a diagnosis checklist in the template editor. Specifically, the video will cover adding a diagnosis checklist to a template, configuring the checklist properties, diagnosis groups, and adding diagnosis codes and labels to the diagnosis checklist. The diagnosis checklist allows a list of diagnoses to be used and selected in a template. The list can be as long or as short as you choose. Typically, the diagnoses configured here correspond to the diagnoses that are listed on your charge slip. When creating the checklist, you have the ability to create groups in which to categorize different types of diagnosis codes, thereby allowing you to easily find codes. These groups will appear as tabs along the top of the checklist. When specific diagnosis codes are added to the checklist, they will be automatically separated into Icd-9 codes and Icd-10 codes, depending upon the code selected. And within the Icd-9 and Icd-10 section, you have the ability to create labels to further sort the diagnosis codes. The following sections will walk you through adding a diagnosis checklist to a template and then configuring the checklist for use. To add a diagnosis checklist to a template, you must first access the template list by clicking View and then Template List. Once the template list has been accessed, you need to select the applicable template you want to add the diagnosis checklist to. In the template editor, click Diagnosis List in the Tools list on the left. Once Diagnosis List is highlighted, make any spacing or other adjustments to the area where you want the diagnosis checklist to appear, and then position the cursor where you want the diagnosis checklist to appear in the template. After the cursor is blinking in the location you want the new diagnosis checklist to appear, click the corresponding button and the diagnosis checklist will then appear in the template. To begin configuring the diagnosis checklist that you have just added, click the Properties button to access the Diagnosis Checklist Properties dialog. When the Diagnosis Checklist Properties dialog appears, you will see various fields and columns that allow you to configure what information will appear when diagnoses are selected and removed in a chart note. To begin, in the heading field, enter the text you want to appear as a label for the diagnosis checklist. This will be the name of the checklist and will appear in the blue bar at the top of the checklist when selecting the checklist in the chart note. If you want the heading to appear in the patient note, be sure that the corresponding Hide Output box to the right is unchecked. If the Hide Output box is checked, the heading will not appear in the patient's chart note. You can then click into the New Diagnoses field and enter the beginning statement or text that will appear before any diagnoses added in the current note. In the corresponding delimiter and conjunctions fields, you can enter the applicable delimiter and conjunction for the new diagnoses field. A delimiter is the punctuation or text that will appear between each selected item in the checklist for the designated field. The most common delimiter would typically be a comma. However, if you want each item to be its own sentence, then use a period in this field. Other options would be to use the \r or \n functionality. A conjunction is the punctuation or text that will appear before the last selected item in the checklist for the designated field. Common conjunctions would be and, or. If you want each item to be its own sentence, then use a period in this field. Other options would be to use the \r or \n functionality. You can add or modify the verbiage in the Remove Diagnoses, Pre-existing Diagnoses, and Ongoing Diagnoses fields, as well as the corresponding delimiter and conjunctions, in a similar manner as we just configured the New Diagnoses field. The verbiage in these fields will precede the diagnoses that fall within these types of diagnoses when selected. For example, whatever verbiage is in the Remove Diagnoses field will precede any diagnoses that were resolved in the current note, while whatever verbiage is in the pre-existing diagnoses will precede any diagnoses that were updated or modified in the current note, and whatever verbiage is in the Ongoing Diagnosis field will precede any diagnosis that is currently in the patient's chart but is not modified in any manner. However, unlike the New Diagnoses field, for these fields you also have the ability to determine whether or not the corresponding text and the accompanying diagnoses will print in the chart note by whether or not the adjacent Hide Output box is checked or not checked. If the Hide Output box is checked next to the field, the configured verbiage and corresponding diagnoses selected in the chart note will not print. If this box is unchecked, the verbiage and corresponding diagnoses will print. Next, in the End of List field, enter any punctuation or text you want to appear at the end of the diagnosis checklist, if needed. Typically, this will be a period and \n for creating a space between the diagnosis checklist text and any other subsequent note text. You can now enter the number of columns for the diagnosis checklist. You can have between 1 and 4 columns for the checklist. When you have finished configuring the diagnosis checklist properties, click the OK button. In preparation for the ICD-10 transition, which has a start date of October 1st, 2014, it is highly recommended that you create or update your diagnosis checklist for your templates. Diagnosis checklists are updated via the template editor. This video will walk you through a general overview of adding and configuring a diagnosis checklist in the template editor. Specifically, the video will cover adding a diagnosis checklist to a template, configuring the checklist properties, diagnosis groups, and adding diagnosis codes and labels to the diagnosis checklist. Diagnosis groups can be created to assist in categorizing diagnosis codes for easy access and use. Groups will appear as tabs in the diagnosis checklist and can be reordered as desired. A required system-based group, unspecified, will also be present that cannot be removed but can be renamed. Once saved, the diagnosis checklist will show tabs at the top labeled based on the text entered and in the order chosen. When clicked, the screen will change to show the diagnosis selected for that particular group. To add or maintain diagnosis groups, click the Group Maintenance button. In the Group Maintenance dialog, any previously entered groups, along with the system-based group, will be displayed. You can add a new group, rename an existing group, delete an existing group, and modify the order of a group. To add a new group, click the Add button, and a new group entry will appear. To rename this new group, highlight the new group and begin typing the new group name. You can also rename an existing group in a similar manner, as well as click anywhere in the group name so that the cursor appears, and then modify as needed. To modify the position of a group, highlight the applicable group and then use the Move Up or Move Down button to change the position of that group. To delete a group, highlight the group you want to delete, and then click the Delete button. Do note, however, that if a group has diagnosis codes configured in it, it cannot be deleted. Only empty groups can be deleted. When finished making additions and modifications, click the OK button. The groups will then appear in the diagnosis checklist as configured. When diagnosis codes and labels are added to the checklist via the Search Add Diagnosis and Add Label buttons, they are inserted into the currently selected group only. You can then copy or move diagnosis and labels to another group, or you can remove them as needed. In the diagnosis dialog, any diagnoses that have already been added will be listed, separated between ICD-10 and ICD-9 codes. Likewise, any groups will be displayed at the top as different tabs. To add a new diagnosis to the checklist, click the applicable group, if needed, and then click the Search Add Diagnosis button. In the Diagnosis Search dialog, you can perform an ICD-10 search, an Icd-9 search, as well as utilize the crosswalk functionality, which allows you to enter an Icd-9 code, and then the system will return the applicable Icd-10 codes that match that initial Icd-9 code. When performing an Icd-10 search or using the crosswalk option, the dialog will also contain a tree view in the middle column of all the diagnoses, as well as a detailed pane, the right column, that further details the selected diagnosis. Once the diagnosis is selected, it will appear in the Selected Codes section in the corresponding Icd-10 or Icd-9 column, depending upon the type of code. After you click the OK button, those diagnoses will be separated into sections in the checklist based on what type of code they use, Icd-10 or Icd-9. Do note that it is recommended that you add the majority of the diagnoses that you will be using in this initial phase. When diagnosis codes are first entered, they will be arranged in alphabetical order in the applicable section of the checklist. After that initial round in which diagnosis codes were added, whenever you have to add additional codes to the checklist, they will appear at the bottom of the list and will need to be manually moved to their proper position. To perform an Icd-10 search, be sure that the Icd-10 Search option is selected above, then select the applicable search column and search type, and then begin typing the diagnosis you want to locate in the description field. For our example, we will use hypertension. The system will then return diagnoses that match that description for the search column and search type selected. Once the applicable code has been located, highlight that code in the left column, and the applicable code will become highlighted in the diagnostic tree in the middle column, and the right column will display detailed information regarding the selected diagnosis. In our case, we'll highlight essential or primary hypertension, and the diagnosis will be selected in the diagnostic tree, and the detailed information will appear in the right pane. To add that code, click the Add to Selected Codes button. The code will then appear in the Selected Codes area under the Icd-10 column. From here you can scroll through the tree for similar diagnoses, select a different diagnosis in the left pane, or refine your search to locate a different diagnosis. Or you can click the Icd-9 Search button to locate Icd-9 codes, or click Crosswalk to use the crosswalk functionality. To perform an Icd-9 search, be sure that the Icd-9 Search option is selected above, then select the applicable search column and search type, and then begin typing the diagnosis you want to locate in the description field. Here again we will use hypertension, but notice how when we click from Icd-10 Search to Icd-9 Search, the description that we previously entered remains. This allows you to easily toggle between searches to help you locate the specific diagnosis code you are searching for. Once the applicable code has been located, highlight that code and then click the Add to Selected Codes button. The code will then appear in the Selected Codes area under the Icd-9 column. You can then add additional Icd-9 codes in a similar manner, or perform an Icd-10 search, or use the crosswalk. To use the crosswalk option, be sure that the crosswalk option is selected above, and then enter the specific Icd-9 code you would like to match to an applicable Icd-10 code. Do note that if you highlight a code in the Icd-9 Search area, that code will default into the description field when you select the crosswalk option. The system will then return Icd-10 codes that match that Icd-9 code in the description field. Once the applicable code has been located, highlight that code in the left column, and the applicable code will become highlighted in the diagnostic tree in the middle column, and the right column will display detailed information regarding the selected diagnosis. In our example, we will highlight the only diagnosis, essential or primary hypertension, and the diagnosis will be selected in the diagnostic tree, and the detailed information will appear in the right pane. To add that code, click the Add to Selected Codes button. The code will then appear in the Selected Codes area under the ICD-10 column. From here, you can scroll through the tree for similar diagnoses, select a different diagnosis in the left pane if applicable, or refine your search to locate a different diagnosis. Or you can click the Icd-10 Search button to locate Icd-10 codes, or click the Icd-9 Search button to locate Icd-9 codes. Once the diagnosis codes have been selected as needed and appear in the Selected Codes area, you have the ability to remove any of these codes from the selected codes by highlighting the applicable diagnosis codes and then clicking the Remove from Selected Codes button. Do note that it is recommended that you add the majority of the diagnoses that you will be using in this initial phase. When diagnosis codes are first entered, they will be arranged in alphabetical order in the applicable section of the checklist. After that initial round in which diagnosis codes were added, whenever you have to add additional codes to the checklist, they will appear at the bottom of the list and will need to be manually moved to their proper position. When the applicable Icd-9 and Icd-10 codes appear in the Selected Codes area, as needed, click the OK button. Once diagnosis codes have been initially added to the checklist, they will appear in alphabetical order reading left to right in the applicable Icd-10 or Icd-9 section. When additional codes are added for each section, they will appear at the bottom of the list. You can modify the position of a code by clicking and dragging the applicable code to the desired position. To copy a diagnosis to a different group, right-click the diagnosis in the Diagnosis checklist, then click Copy to Group, and then click the applicable group. That diagnosis will remain in the current group, as well as be copied to the selected group. To move a diagnosis from a current group to another group, right-click the diagnosis in the Diagnosis checklist, then click Move to Group, and then click the applicable group. That diagnosis will then be removed from the current group and move to the selected group. To remove a diagnosis from a diagnosis checklist, right-click the diagnosis that you want to delete and then click Remove. This will remove the diagnosis from the list. A label acts as a separator for a group of diagnoses in a checklist. Labels cannot be clicked on to perform any functionality, but instead work as markers to group various diagnoses into categories. When creating labels, that label can be added to either the Icd-9 or Icd-10 section of the checklist. To add a label to a diagnosis checklist, click the Add Label button. In the Add Label dialog, enter the label text you want to appear in the diagnosis checklist. Click the Icd-10 radio button if you want this label to appear in the Icd-10 section of the diagnosis checklist, or click the Icd-9 radio button if you want this label to appear in the Icd-9 section of the checklist. When finished, click the OK button. The label will then appear in the selected section of the diagnosis checklist at the bottom of the list. You can modify the position of the label by clicking and dragging the label to the desired position. Labels can also be copied and moved to different diagnosis groups in a similar manner as diagnosis codes. Likewise, labels can be removed in a similar manner as well. simply right-click the label and click Remove. When finished adding and modifying diagnosis codes and labels in the diagnosis checklist, click the OK button. This concludes the ICD-10 template editing video. For more detailed information on adding and modifying diagnosis checklists in the template editor, consult our online help system by clicking the F1 key when in the clinical application. To replay this video, click the replay button. If you would like to replay a particular section of the video, you can click the appropriate entry in the table of contents to the left at any time.